Hey there, Griff Hamlin here. Welcome and thanks for joining me today. In today's video, we're going to talk about, I guess, what you would officially call chord substitutions. And this is something for your blues rhythm playing. I often get asked, we have these chords like 7 chords and 9 chords and 11 chords and 13 chords and all these different chords. When do I use them? Because if you look, usually when we talk about blues, we talk about, the dominant 7th chord. Okay, so for example, an A7, right? You might play an A7 like this. This is a common way, but as you've probably seen before, particularly when playing with a band, I don't use the lower strings. Okay, so I always just use the upper versions of these chords, and I highly recommend that you do the same when you're playing in a group setting. So I might have an A7 like that, or an A7 like that. If you know that open A7, again, I'm just using the top part. I could move that up an octave, right? And these are all just A7s. I could use my, sort of baseball bat grip. There's a D7, right? But here it's an A7. So these are all 7 chords. There's different kinds of 7 chords. But what about like a 9th chord? Well, it turns out that 7th chords, 9th chords, 11th chords, and 13th chords are all in the same chord family. Okay, it's the dominant chord family. Okay, so fundamentally, for you theory heads out there, they all have a root, they all have a third, they all have a fifth, and they all have a flatted 7th. That's the dominant 7th. If you add the 9, you get a 9th chord. If you add the 9 and 11, you get an 11th chord. If you add 9, 11, and 13, you have a rather tall chord, a 13th chord. It actually has every note in the scale, just all spread out. So it's a big chord. Obviously, we can't play that on a guitar, right? So, we might play something like this, right? There's one way to play a 13, something like that. Believe it or not, that's an A13. There's the flatted 7th, okay? This is kind of a cool chord if you can't play the root because you don't have enough fingers, but you get the flatted 7th with the G at the 5th fret of the 4th string. You get the 9 with the B at the 4th fret of the 3rd string. You get the 3rd with the C sharp there at the 2nd fret of the 2nd string. And you get the F sharp, which is the 6 or the 13 up there on the 1st string. Okay, so that's kind of a cool one. So, this is an A13 with the 9 on the top. There's that kind of 13. There's, like this is a 9th chord that has the root on the top. There's a lot of different chords. And I don't really want to take this video to walk you through a bunch of different chord shapes. I will put on the blog post with this video, I will put a link to a sort of a standard chord sheet that I use for a lot of my students. And it's really kind of all of the standard, most common chord shapes that blues players use. And there's really not as many as you'd think. But if you look in like a chord book, you get these chord books with like 1,001 chords in them. And the problem is that some of them, look like this. They're these really bizarre looking chords that you would never actually play. That's 980 of them. And then the other 20 are the ones that are useful. So I'll leave you a link to that. But all of these different chords, the main thing is once you've learned these chords, okay, well, now what? What do you do with them? Okay, and that's where I think the confusion comes in more so than the chords themselves. Because again, if you look at a chart for, Sweet Home Chicago, it's going to say E7, A7, and B7. Well, does that mean you have to play E7, A7, and B7? No. If you like the sound of it, instead of E7, you could play E9, E11, or E13. And they all have kind of, their own characteristic voice. Instead of A7, you could play A9, A11, A13. Instead of B7, right, you could play B9, B11, B13. So in the key of A, right, A, D, and E. So instead of the 7th, we can always do the 9, 11, and 13. So if I have sort of my standard comping pattern, right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. And that's a, quick change blues. A7. I use D9, right? We do that all the time. We use the D9 instead of the D7. But let's say that I don't. Let's just say I stick with A7 and D7, right? So my first 2 bars in a quick change, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Right? Basic. And this will work all day long. And back to the 1, 2. And this works great. And we use it all the time. 5 chord, 4 chord, and 1 chord, and 5. Okay? But at any point, we can start messing things up, right? So the most common one is we use that 9th chord, right? Instead of the 7. And that is a chord substitution. What if we wanted to use like a 13? Right? 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. That might sound good, or maybe up here. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. And maybe that's too big of a jump. Maybe you want something more like 1, 2, 3. How about D9 here instead of here? Put it there, or here. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2. Right? So we can get all these different variations. 1, 2, 3. How about that 13, 9? 13 with the 9 on top. And maybe you want to hold one out to really make it stick. Okay? Now, the thing about this, though, is you got to put your big ears on. Because if, let's say you're playing in a band and there's a keyboard player, and you jump on a 13 with a 9 on top, and let's say the singer or the keyboard player is playing a 7 with a sharp 9. They're trying to get something funky going on. If you play a regular 9 and they play a sharp 9, there might be a little bit of chaos, right? It might get to sound a little bit of a cluster because you're going to have, this note and this note right next to each other, which is, some people, that's their favorite sound in the world. Other people, not so much. So, but it's not as common, so you might not dig it quite so much. So as the chords get more elaborate and more difficult, more tense, more notes in them, the 9th chords almost always work. You almost hardly even notice the difference between a 9th and a 7th, right? But if I do like an 11, now an 11 chord is a weird chord. You don't see it very often. It would be something like that. It's like, here's a G chord, and I put it over an A bass note. Right? And I can either have my pinky on the top for the A root or the G root, the G on the top. That's kind of the best way to play that. So you're basically going A like this. And that might sound really cool, but it's almost a little bit jazzy to some people. So some people don't like the sound of the 11. I'm not here to pass judgment on it. I use an 11 once in a while. It just depends on the mood and the tune. But admittedly, I don't use them very often. They can sound really cool, though, so it's something that you should experiment with, no doubt. Something like a 13 chord, right? That might sound really cool in a comp, coming up to the 4. You could go from here to that 4, or that, maybe moving up to a 9, right? There's a lot of different options, and you can mix and match them all you want. There's no rule here. And that's the point that I think I have to get across the most is there's no standard, there's no rule about this. You can switch, you can mix and match all day long. If it satisfies your ear and doesn't offend anybody else on the bandstand, go with it. It's a good sound, right? You can absolutely use these sounds all you want, with no restriction. Okay, these are not sometimes chords. These are anytime chords. For those of you, anyway, that's an old reference to like Sesame Street or something. But you can use these chords all you want. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to just kind of demonstrate this. I don't know if there's any point in really tabbing this out because I'm just going to make this up, and you should do the same thing. Where I'm just going to choose. Just pick one. Now, if you're not familiar with a lot of these different shapes, then pick one, okay? And start first, play through all with 7th chords, play through the track, and then substitute for your one new chord, right? Put that one new chord in and play it until you get used to it, until you like the sound of it. And then add one more new chord and play it until you get used to it and you like the sound of it. Don't just, unless you really, really know these chords already, don't try to swap out 8 or 10 of them all at once. It'll just be confusing and overwhelming. One chord at a time if this is new to you, okay? So I'm just going to put on a track and kind of play and let you see kind of what I'm doing. But this is really just an idea generator for you. I don't want you to I don't want to write this out and have you learn it. I want you to try it. I want you to try it for yourself. So I'm going to leave on the page, of course, I'll put the chord chart, and I'll leave. This is the same jam track I use for my 4-note solo, so I'll leave a download for that as well. And you can try it out for yourself and just experiment. The big thing with this is experiment. Try different chords. Maybe, if you find a chord that you've never played before, try that one. See if you like the sound of it. Sometimes you might like a chord. You can try something a little out, like a 7♯9. That might sound really good right before the 4 chord, but you probably don't want to just hang out there. But maybe on the 5 chord, you might like a 7♯9, right? It's kind of Hendrixy. So there's a lot of different options, and some you're going to like and some you're not. That's okay. The main point is that you experiment and you try stuff and you build that experience level for yourself. All right? So I'm going to play along with the track. Hope you dug the video. I hope you'll do the same today, and I look forward to talking to you soon. 1, 2.